Most logical reasoning questions are built around one simple idea. Here's an argument. Can you figure out what's wrong, what's missing, or what would help it? Seems straightforward, right? The names of the questions are so obvious that most students walk in overconfident. Flaw question? No problem. I'll just find the flaw. Strengthen question? Great. I'll pick the answer that makes the argument better. And then the choices all start blending together. You reread the stimulus 3 times. You talk yourself into and out of every single option. Finally, you pick something that sounds right and you move on, hoping for the best. And this is where the LSAT gets sneaky. The question types don't test whether you understand the argument, they test whether you can spot what's not being said. And that's a completely different skill. The test makers already assume you can read. They assume you understand the words. They assume you can summarize the conclusion. But what they're really asking is, can you detect invisible assumptions? Because every LSAT argument, and I mean every single one, has some kind of hidden leap in logic. And sometimes that leap is huge. Sometimes it's subtle, but it's always there. And if you don't get into the habit of pausing, zooming out, and finding that gap, you're gonna end up choosing answers based on gut instinct instead of logic, which is exactly what the test wants. So if these questions feel slippery, it's not because they're hard in the traditional sense. It's because they trick you into skipping the thinking step. They tempt you with shiny, polished answer choices. They phrase things in confident, logical-sounding language. And unless you're trained to pause and say, hold up, what's the gap between evidence and conclusion? You're going to fall for it. And here's the worst part. Most students don't even realize they're skipping that step. They just think, oh, I'm bad at weekend questions. But it's not about the question type. It's about your process. And the good news is that this is fixable. Once you build the habit of always identifying the gap before reading the choices, you start to see the arguments for what they really are. They're incomplete, they're assumption heavy, and they are ripe for attack or support. And suddenly, you're not hoping you picked the right answer, you're confidently spotting it because it's the only one that directly addresses the gap you already found. Which is why I always say, logical reasoning isn't about getting smarter, it's about building better habits. Most students have the intelligence. They're just using the wrong mental playbook. You don't need to work harder or read more carefully. You've got to change how you approach the argument in the first place. So if you're struggling, if you feel like you have weak spots, don't panic. You're not broken. You're just skipping the most important step. First, you've got to find the gap, and then you're going to watch everything click into place. Now, let me walk you through a real pattern I've seen thousands of times with my students. A student will come to me and say, I always mess up strengthening questions, or I just can't get weekend questions right. They think the problem is the question type. So they go do 100 more strengthening questions. They do drills, they make flashcards, they brute force their way through it, and they still get them wrong. Why? Because they're trying to fix something without knowing what's broken. It's like trying to build a bridge with random planks and hoping they line up over the river, or walking into the garage, picking up a random tool and saying, maybe this wrench will fix the car. Meanwhile, you haven't even opened up the hood. Here's the thing no one tells you. If you go straight to the choices without first figuring out what the gap in the argument is, you're already in trouble. Why? Because you are trying to analyze an argument, but you don't actually know what the problem is yet. So your brain starts looking for something that sounds logical instead of something that actually targets the flaw. That's how the LSAT traps you. The wrong answers are designed to sound smart. They use impressive vocabulary, they reference statistics, they say things like research indicates or a majority of respondents. but they don't address the real issue in the argument, and that's why they're wrong. Now, the fix is not complicated, but it is essential. Every time you read an argument, stop and ask yourself three things in this exact order. First, what's the conclusion? Don't just assume. Find the sentence the author is trying to prove. Not what sounds true, not what's interesting, but the main claim. Then ask, what is the evidence? Find what the author gives you to support the conclusion. That might be a statistic, an example, a trend, or a weirdly specific hypothetical. Then ask, what's the gap between them? And this is the million-dollar question. What is the author assuming? What connection are they making that isn't guaranteed? Until you've done these three steps, you're not ready for the choices. I don't care how good your vocabulary is. I don't care if you're naturally good at reading comprehension. If you don't diagnose the problem before trying to solve it, you're guessing. And guess what? At LSAT level difficulty, guessing doesn't work. You might get lucky once, maybe twice, but over the course of 50 logical reasoning questions, luck runs out and precision wins. Now I get it. This might feel slow at first. You're thinking, wait, you want me to stop and dissect every argument like this? I'm never going to finish the section, Steve. And yes, it is slower at first. But once you build this habit, your brain starts doing it on autopilot. You're not going to have to force yourself to find the gap. It's going to jump out at you. And suddenly, the choices start sorting themselves. If B sounds good, but doesn't touch the gap, it's out. If C addresses the exact assumption, that's the one. It's a total mindset shift. You stop hoping the right answer jumps out at you, and instead, you start knowing what it has to look like. And that changes everything. So before we go into specific question types, I want you to commit to one thing. Never go to the choices before first finding the gap. Think of it like brushing your teeth before you leave the house. You might be in a rush, you might be tired, but you do it anyway because the consequences of skipping it are not worth it. Same here. Find the gap every single time. Now let's start off with flaw questions, because flaw questions might be viewed as the foundation for all other types. If you can spot flaws in the reasoning, the rest become 10 times easier. But if you skip this step, everything feels like a guessing game. What are flaw questions actually asking? They're not just saying, find something bad about the argument. They're really saying, the author thinks their logic is airtight. Can you spot where it's actually made up of just cardboard and tape? Your job is to find the hole, the logical leap they're pretending doesn't exist. So for example, suppose you have an argument saying, quote, studies show that people who read historical biographies tend to score higher on vocabulary tests. Therefore, if schools assigned more biographies, students' vocabularies would improve. Might sound fine at first glance, but let's break it down using our three-step diagnostic. First, what's the conclusion? Assigning biographies will lead to an improvement in vocabulary. Evidence? People who already read biographies have better vocabulary. Now, what's the gap? Wait, just because some biography readers have better vocabulary doesn't mean that biographies caused the better vocabulary. Maybe these people read other things. Maybe they're just smarter. Maybe they've been doing crossword puzzles since the age of 6. We don't know. The author took a correlation and treated it like a causation. That's like saying, every time I wear my red socks, I score higher on my practice tests. So clearly, the red socks are helping. Nope, that is a flaw. And that's your job. Spot it, name it, and eliminate all the fake answers that miss the real issue. Now, the tricky part is that the arguments often sound logical. They're phrased in professional, confident language. You'll see phrases like, research has consistently demonstrated, or it follows that, or clearly, and you're supposed to read all that and say, nice try, but no. You've got to be that slightly cynical friend who can smell BS a mile away. Now, every time you get one of these, again, ask, what's the author trying to prove? What's the conclusion? Secondly, what are they using to justify it? What's the evidence? And ask yourself, does that really prove the conclusion? If not, what's missing? Then, and this is where it gets fun, channel your inner skeptical lawyer or your sarcastic roommate. For our biography example, you could challenge them by saying, oh, assigning 10th graders a book on Teddy Roosevelt will just magically improve their vocabulary? Great, I'm sure they won't just fall asleep halfway through chapter 1. And it's not about being rude here. It's about training your brain to poke holes in weak logic. That's what lawyers do, and that's what the LSAT rewards. Now, the good news is the LSAT doesn't invent brand new flaws every single time. They just dress them up differently. Here are some that show up again and again. A big one is correlation does not equal causation. That is a classic. If two things happened together, does that mean one caused the other? Not necessarily. Could be a third factor, could be a coincidence, or the causality could be reversed. The second big one is overgeneralization. A small group is observed and the author makes a broad claim. 5 ducks prefer jazz, therefore, all ducks love jazz. Pump the brakes, hold up. Just because 5 ducks like jazz doesn't mean that all ducks like jazz. We can't overgeneralize on the basis of a very small example. The third big one is false dilemma, where the author says there are only 2 options when in reality, there could be more. If they say, quote, either we raise taxes or the city collapses, you could think to yourself, wait, what about budget cuts or grants? A fourth common flaw is confusing necessary and sufficient conditions. For example, if you eat eggs, you're healthy. I'm healthy, therefore I ate eggs. Maybe you just exercise and you sleep well. Fifth big one is bad analogy, comparing 2 things that aren't actually similar. For example, what if they say, running a business is just like baking a cake? Hold up, is it really just like baking a cake? There might be some similarities, but unless your cake has quarterly projections, no, it's not. And these flaw types don't change. They just get better at disguising themselves, and your job is to unmask them. Now, LSAT choices for flaw questions fall into 3 major categories. Some of them are going to be spot on where they nail the actual gap. Others are generic, but true. They sound logical, but they don't match the argument's flaw. And some of them are completely off topic. They are fancy sounding nonsense. And you don't want the ones that are generic but true. Those are the ones that make you think, that sounds smart, right before you get it wrong. The right answer always points out the exact move the author made that's logically sketchy. Now let's talk about evaluate the argument questions. At first glance, these look kind of weird. The question stem will say something like, which one of the following would be most useful to know in evaluating the argument? And you're like, wait, are they asking me to answer the question or to come up with another question? The answer is neither. What evaluate questions really want is this. Hey, here's an argument. If you could ask just one question to see whether the argument is solid or total garbage, what would you ask? That's it. You're testing the strength of the argument, not fixing it, not breaking it, just figuring out how strong or weak it already is. Let's walk through it with an example. Suppose they said, quote, the city replaced its buses with electric buses. Afterward, pollution levels went down. Therefore, the new buses caused the pollution to drop. Again, it sounds fine, but if you've been paying attention, you can already spot the classic flaw. Correlation does not equal causation. So now you ask, what would help me test whether the new buses actually caused the drop in pollution? Here's a good question. Did any other major environmental changes happen at the same time? If the answer is yes, for example, a polluting factory shut down, that weakens the argument. If the answer is no, nothing else changed, that strengthens it. Bingo, you just passed the evaluate test. Now, every evaluate answer choice is basically a question. Your job is to test it using this. If the answer to the question were yes, would it strengthen the argument? If the answer were no, would it weaken it? If the answer is yes strengthens, no weakens, or vice versa, that's your right answer. If both yes and no lead to no change, or just feel kind of meh, cross it out. Now, the reason most people get evaluate questions wrong is because they chase the interesting answer. Here's what that looks like. You read an answer like, electric buses are more expensive than diesel buses. And you think, oh wow, that's interesting. I didn't know that. Cool. But does it help you judge whether the buses caused the drop in pollution? Nope. It's a cost issue, not a cause and effect issue. It's a trap answer, so it's out. The LSAT loves writing answers that sound smart, important, or informative, but are completely irrelevant to the argument's strength. If an answer doesn't help you evaluate the logical link between the evidence and the conclusion, you want to toss it. Now let's be crystal clear here. Strong evaluate answers will usually do one of these. They will ask whether a possible alternative cause existed. They will ask whether the assumption behind the conclusion holds up. They will ask about the reliability of the evidence. They will ask whether the effect occurred in the absence of the cause. And they will ask about comparative situations, like maybe, was this the only city that tried electric buses? Did they also see drops? If an answer touches one of those, check the extremes. If it passes, lock it in. Now here's a playbook you can use every time. First, find the conclusion and the evidence, just like you did for flaw questions. ID the assumption or the possible gap. Ask yourself, what question would confirm or destroy this connection? Then, check the extremes for every choice. If yes and no produce opposite effects, it's probably correct. If they both produce no change, or they both strengthen it, throw it out. Now let's clear it up. Evaluate questions are not asking for the most interesting fact, the most dramatic new data point, or the prettiest answer with the fanciest language. They're just asking, what do you wish you knew before trusting this argument? That's the shift. Now let's talk about strengthen questions. These ask you, what piece of new information would help this argument hold up better? That's it. You're not rewriting the argument. You're not solving world hunger. You're just giving the argument support, like adding a beam under a wobbly bridge. And the key is knowing where to put that support, right at the gap between the evidence and conclusion. Here's an example. Quote, an app developer found that users who receive daily motivational texts are more likely to reach their exercise goals. Therefore, receiving motivational texts causes people to exercise more. So if you've been following along so far, you probably already see the flaw. Correlation does not equal causation. Now it's your job to add a piece of information that makes this connection more believable. Here is a solid strengthened answer. Quote, users who turned off motivational texts were significantly less likely to meet their goals. That is perfect. It doesn't prove the argument though, but that's okay. LSAT strengthened answers rarely do, but they do make the conclusion more likely to be true, and that's all it needs to do. Now, the LSAT, of course, will try to trick you. So let's say it gave you this answer instead. Quote, users who received motivational texts also received daily nutritional advice. Sounds helpful, right? But no, it actually hurts the argument. Why? Because now you don't know whether the motivation or the nutrition advice caused the improvement. You just introduced a second variable, and that weakens the argument. And this is a classic LSAT trap. They make the answer look relevant, but they sneak in something that introduces doubt or confusion. Your job is to stay laser focused and ask, does this answer directly make the connection between evidence and conclusion stronger? If not, you want to toss it. Now, most strengthened answers fall into one of the following buckets. The big one is ruling out alternatives. For example, if we learned no other new health apps were introduced during the study, that eliminates some other possible causes, which in turn strengthens the conclusion. A strengthener might also confirm the assumption. Suppose we learned users didn't already have higher motivation before the texts began. This helps us believe that the texts actually made a difference. Or a strengthener might provide additional consistent data. For example, a second study showed the same pattern in a different population. More data means more support, which means a stronger argument. Now, let's be crystal clear about something. Just because something is true, interesting, related to the topic, or vaguely positive sounding does not mean it necessarily strengthens the argument. You could read an answer that says the app also has a common color scheme and pleasant font. That's cool, but it's completely irrelevant. If it doesn't directly make the argument's logic stronger, it's a distraction. The LSAT loves this kind of bait. Don't fall for it. So every time you see a strengthening question, here's what I want you to do. First, find the conclusion and the evidence. Then, spot the gap. Ask, what is the author assuming? Then, look at each answer and ask, if this were true, would it make the conclusion more likely? If it confirms the assumption or it rules out an alternative, it's probably the right answer. However, if it adds a new variable, weakens the argument, or just sounds vaguely relevant, eliminate it. Now, a lot of students look for answers that 100% prove the argument. But you don't need that. LSAT strengthened answers don't have to make the argument airtight. They just need to move the needle in the right direction. If the argument was shaky, and now it's slightly less shaky, that's a strengthener. Now, let's talk about weakened questions where your job is to sabotage the argument. Your job is to introduce just enough new information to make the argument wobble. Not to destroy it, and not to argue with the facts, just to slip in one well-placed idea that makes the conclusion a little harder to believe. If a strengthening question has you tighten the screws, a weakened question has you loosen the screws until the whole thing starts to creak. Here's an example. Suppose you had an argument saying, quote, sales of printed cookbooks have dropped. At the same time, food-related YouTube channels have exploded in popularity. Therefore, people must be turning to YouTube instead of cookbooks to learn how to cook. Might sound logical, but let's look at the logic. The evidence says cookbook sales dropped and YouTube food videos increased. Conclusion, YouTube is replacing cookbooks for learning. So, what's missing? What's the assumption? That people are using YouTube for instruction, not just entertainment. Now imagine one of the choices says, quote, most viewers of food-related YouTube channels report that they rarely cook the dishes they watch. Bam, that directly undercuts the argument. If people aren't using videos to cook, then maybe they're not replacing cookbooks, they're just watching Gordon Ramsay yell at people for fun. That is a textbook weaken move. Now for weakened questions, remember, don't attack the evidence. Instead, attack the connection between the evidence and conclusion. This is critical. If the stimulus says, cookbook sales have dropped, you cannot say, actually, cookbook sales increased. That's not weakening, that is contradicting a premise. The LSAT will not let you do that. Instead, you look at the logic and ask, is there another explanation for this evidence? Is there a missing variable? Is the conclusion based on a bad assumption? Then you pick the answer that exposes that weakness. Now here are 3 reliable ways to weaken an argument. The first is to introduce an alternative explanation. For example, people might be cooking less overall regardless of YouTube. That would explain the drop in cookbook sales without blaming YouTube. The second way is to challenge the assumption. For example, most YouTube viewers don't actually cook the recipes. If that's true, then YouTube can't be replacing cookbooks for learning to cook. The third way is to point out a new variable. For example, a recession led people to cut spending on books, including cookbooks. That shows a different reason for the sales drop, again, not YouTube. Now, a lot of choices will try to fool you with subtle traps, like a fact is true and interesting, but it doesn't challenge the argument's logic, or this introduces new information, but it supports rather than weakens, or this is emotionally persuasive, but irrelevant to the reasoning. Let's say the argument is about electric cars reducing emissions, and the answer says, many electric car owners are proud to be environmentally conscious. Cool, but does that hurt the logic? Nope, so eliminate it. Now your job for weakened questions is to first find the conclusion and the evidence, then ID the assumption the author is making, and ask, what would make this assumption less believable? And finally, evaluate each answer. If it introduces a new explanation, alternate cause, or challenges the logic, keep it. But if it contradicts the premise or sounds unrelated, eliminate it. Now, sometimes the LSAT flips the trap. you'll see a choice that actually strengthens the argument slightly. And your brain, because it likes nice, clean logic, will go, "Ooh, that sounds cool." But you're not here to be nice. If you find yourself nodding at an answer, double check that you're actually weakening the argument. Now let's bring this home. We talked about flaw questions, evaluate, strengthen, and weaken. 4 different question types, 4 different question stems. But underneath all of them, you have the same exact skill, finding the gap. If you walk away from this episode with just one idea tattooed onto your logical soul, make it this. Always, always, always find the gap between the evidence and the conclusion before reading the choices. Sounds simple, but most students never actually do it. Instead, they skim the stimulus. They glance at the question stem. Then they dive headfirst into the choices, hoping something sounds LSAT-ish. It's like trying to pick the best medicine before you even know what the diagnosis is. Bad idea, and the LSAT knows it. Because once you've gotten to the answer choices, it's too late. You're now in the danger zone. Every word has been engineered to sound tempting. And each trap is handcrafted by someone whose job is literally to mess with overconfident pre-law students' brains. And here's the wild part. Most wrong answers are not obviously wrong. They're answers to different questions. They're answers that feel kinda right. They're clever, precise, and totally irrelevant to the actual gap in the argument. And if you didn't find that gap first, you're not even gonna know they're wrong. So let's say you're doing a weekend question, you don't find the gap, you just look at the conclusion that cookbooks are being replaced by YouTube, then you jump into the answers. You see choice A, cookbook prices have increased 20%. B, some YouTube viewers also buy cookbooks. C, most YouTube viewers don't actually cook. D, YouTube content varies by region. And E, cookbooks are often given as gifts. Now, if you don't have the gap in mind, that the argument assumes people are actually learning to cook from YouTube, you could pick any of these and convince yourself it sounds reasonable. But if you do have the gap in mind, the right answer, choice C, jumps out at you like it's highlighted in neon. That's the power of doing the thinking before the guessing. Now, if you're thinking, okay, Steve, that's great, but how do I actually find the gap? Here is your cheat sheet. First, start with the conclusion. Ask yourself, what is the author trying to prove? Not just what's true, but what are they saying must be true? Next, the evidence. What are they using to support that conclusion? Stats, anecdotes, correlations. Then ask the magic question. Does this evidence guarantee the conclusion? If not, and it won't, what would have to be true to make the conclusion follow from the evidence? That thing that would have to be true, that's your gap. That is the assumption. And that's what every right answer will strengthen, weaken, test, or expose as flawed. And when you know what it is, you don't just pick the right answer, you predict it. Now look, the LSAT is not a test of intelligence. It's a test of precision. And the most successful test takers don't read faster, they don't memorize more, and they don't have any secret hacks. They just do this. They pause, find the conclusion, find the evidence, find the gap, then, and only then, look at the choices. And I know it feels slow at first, but once this becomes automatic, you're not reading 5 answers and weighing pros and cons anymore. You're reading one correct answer and saying, yep, that's the one. Next. That's how you get to 170 and beyond. And once you start thinking this way, once you train yourself to see the gap in every argument, logical reasoning doesn't feel confusing anymore. It starts to feel rigged in your favor. And that's the point. Now, you might be wondering what to do when 2 answer choices both sound good. And that's where the real frustration sets in. You did everything right, you read the stimulus carefully, you find the conclusion, you find the evidence, you spot the gap, you go into the choices with a clear game plan. And then you get hit with this. Wait, A looks good, but C also kind of works. I hate this. Welcome to what I call the great LSAT mirage. 2 choices that both sound smart, both feel reasonable, Both use fancy LSAT language, but one is right and one is a trap. Here's how to deal with it. First, go back to the gap. The single biggest reason students waffle between two choices is they lost sight of the gap. They walk into the choices with a clear idea of what's missing, but the wording of the answers is so polished and logical sounding that it pulls them off track. They start asking, which one sounds smarter? Or which one would be more true in real life? Those are the wrong questions to ask. Go back to asking, what was the assumption in the argument, and which of these two choices directly touches it? One of them usually hits it head on. The other might be related to the topic, but it's answering a question the argument didn't ask. For example, the assumption that stimulus was people are actually using YouTube to learn how to cook. A says YouTube users enjoy watching recipe videos. C says most YouTube viewers don't cook the recipes they watch. They both sound reasonable, but C hits on the exact assumption that watching equals learning equals replacing cookbooks. A is just a fun fact. This is how the LSAT messes with you. Both answers feel good, but only one hits the logic. Your next step is to use the test of precision. When you are torn between two answers, ask which one does exactly what the question stem is asking, no more, no less. The LSAT does not reward extra credit. If a strengthening question asks for a reason the conclusion is more likely to be true, and one answer confirms the assumption while the other gives a cool new fact, guess what? The cool fact is irrelevant, but confirming the assumption, ding ding ding, it's not about sounding smart. It's about doing the job the question asked for. Now this one might feel weird, but it works. Read the answer choice, pause, and say out loud or in your head, this strengthens the argument because, or this weakens the conclusion because. And if you can't finish that sentence clearly and quickly, that's a red flag. This technique forces you to stop reacting emotionally and start thinking logically. It also reveals when an answer choice sounds good, but you can't actually explain why. And that's the trap. Now, this is going to sound harsh, but it's true. If you're picking answers based on vibes, you're playing the wrong game. The LSAT isn't a test of what feels good. It's a test of who did the thinking. When two answers both sound right, it usually means one is slightly off topic, slightly too strong, or slightly irrelevant to the gap. Your job is to step back and say, what was the conclusion? What was the support? What was the missing link? And which answer targets that and only that? Not what sounds fancy, not what you'd want to be true, just what addresses the logic. Now let's get tactical. By now, you understand the deep stuff, the mindset, the logic, the gap, and that's what separates the 160s from the 170s. But on test day, you've got to move fast. You don't have time to give every choice a standing ovation and 3 minutes of analysis. You need shortcuts, mental macros, built-in if this, then that reactions. So in this section, I'm giving you two things. First, red flags. These are the common LSAT tricks that should immediately make you pause or eliminate an answer. I'm also going to give you power moves. These are simple strategies to instantly increase your accuracy without doing extra work. Now, the first big red flag is the interesting but irrelevant trap. And this one shows up everywhere, but especially in strengthen and evaluate questions. The LSAT gives you a fact that's true. It sounds interesting, but it's totally unrelated to the logic. For example, quote, electric buses are more cost efficient than diesel buses. Cool. And that's a budget issue, not an emissions issue. Red flag. If you catch yourself thinking, that's a fun fact, pause and ask, does this affect the logic of the argument at all? If not, eliminate it. The second big red flag is the answer that restates the premise, and these are sneakier. Here, the LSAT gives you an answer that just repeats something the stimulus already said, but in new words, paraphrased. It feels familiar and even a bit comforting, but it's completely useless. Why? Because it doesn't do anything. For example, they say the app sends motivational notifications each day. Yeah, but we already know that. It was already in the stimulus. If an answer adds zero new information, it's not strengthening, weakening, or evaluating anything. It's just filler, so knock it out. The third big red flag is language that is too strong. Watch out for extreme words like always, never, must, cannot, and only if. The LSAT loves to trap students with extreme language that's hard to justify logically. And so unless the stimulus itself is extreme, be skeptical of extreme answers. The fourth big red flag is emotional appeals or vague buzzwords. If an answer starts sounding like an inspirational Instagram caption, back away slowly. For example, quote, people generally strive to improve themselves, or it is widely believed that motivation is helpful. These phrases sound deep, but they're logic-free. They don't attack or support anything specific. If it sounds like it belongs in a motivational speech, not a logic test, eliminate it. Now here are your power move tactics. The first is to predict the gap before the answers. I've said it before, but I'll say it again. Don't read the choices until you know what they need to do. Ask yourself, what's the conclusion? What's the evidence? What's missing? And what kind of answer would be perfect? Then go hunting. The wrong answers will fall apart instantly, and the right one will click. The second is to say, this helps because out loud. Before you choose an answer, say this in your head or quietly if you're in the testing room, this helps because, or this weakens the logic because, and if you can't finish that sentence clearly, don't pick it. This is a fast way to make sure you are thinking logically, not emotionally. The third big power move is to, when in doubt, rephrase the stimulus in dumb language. No joke, this really works. If the argument feels too abstract or too polished, rewrite it like a caveman would. For example, people who take cold showers have more energy, so if everyone takes cold showers, society will be more productive. Rewritten, cold arrow energy. More cold arrow, more energy. Therefore, fix the economy with ice water. If that sounds silly, that's the point. You will see the flaw instantly. Don't be afraid to mentally translate LSAT logic into something a sixth grader would say. It's often the fastest way to cut through the fluff. Logical reasoning is the easiest section to master once you stop treating it like a mystery. It's not a riddle. It's not about being good at logic. It's a game with rules, with patterns, with moves you can learn. And once you stop playing checkers and start playing chess, that's when the 170s happen. Not someday, not if the stars align, just boom, click. Find the gap, predict the answer, trust the process, now go win.